It's been 3 years. I don't count the days anymore, but I know it's been 3 winters since Clara left. 3 summers since I last saw my father in person. Time moves like fog, thick, slow, without clear lines, and yet somehow I've made it through. I live in a small apartment now, with more plants than furniture. Some of them are dying, but I keep watering them anyway. I like the gesture, the attempt. Not everything needs to thrive to be worth tending. I work at a bookstore, the kind with creaky floors and too many stray cats. The owner lets me run the poetry section. I talk to strangers about Neruda, about Rilke, about how language saves us in pieces. It's quiet work. Honest. I've started seeing someone, slowly. Her name is Lila. She has a crooked smile and smells like bergamot and old paper. She doesn't ask for more than I can give. Sometimes we sit together and say nothing, and it feels like prayer. I've learned to live with the silence, not fear it, not fill it, just sit with it, like an old friend who reminds you of things you'd rather forget, but need to remember. Every so often, I think of reaching out to him, just a call, a letter, a chance to say, "You hurt me," but then I imagine his voice, the calmness, the certainty that what he did wasn't wrong, that it was simply the way of things. And I stay silent. He doesn't deserve my forgiveness, but I do. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't about them. It's about laying down the weapons we turned inward. It's about not letting the wound define the story. It's about whispering, "You are more than what they did to you." Sometimes I wonder if Clara regrets it, if she wakes in the night and thinks of me. I don't want her back, but I want to believe I mattered, that I wasn't just a stepping stone towards something sharper. I imagine her aging beside him, watching him become brittle, less certain. Maybe one day she'll see in his silence what I saw, a mirror that only reflects what he wants you to be. But that's her story now, not mine. I light candles for myself now, not for mourning, for presence. I keep a journal still. Some pages are messy, raw. Others are just lists. Things I've done, moments I've survived, reasons I stayed. I'm learning to reclaim my face, to smile without wondering whose mouth I've inherited, to stand without fear that my posture might echo his, to believe I am not a continuation of his story, but the beginning of my own. It's not a happy ending, but it's honest, and maybe that's more important. Sometimes, when the rain falls soft and slow, I put on a record, sit by the window, and let myself feel everything. The grief, the peace, the memory of her touch, the echo of his silence. And I ask myself, not in bitterness, but in wonder, what kind of man might I have become if I had been loved gently from the start? Would I recognize him? Would he recognize me? I'll never know, but I'm still here. And for now, that's enough. Grief doesn't follow a straight line. It loops. It spirals. It's one moment I was stable. The next I was staring at my ceiling at 3 a.m., whispering apologies to the dark. I began to question not only the past, but the fabric of my reality. Had Clara ever really loved me, or had she only loved what I offered? A shelter, a contrast to the storm. I stopped distinguishing memories from dreams. In one, I was a child again, standing at the threshold of my father's study. He was there, but faceless, his voice a guttural echo, telling me, "You're not enough." I'd wake in sweat, heart pounding, unsure if I'd heard those words in sleep or in life. I saw him in everything, in the men who talked too loudly on trains, in supervisors at work who corrected others with a smirk. I'd recoil instinctively, like a dog trained with too many invisible fences. My own body was becoming foreign, my jaw clenched without thought, my shoulders curled inward. I spoke less. One night, I passed by a bar and saw them, him and Clara, through the window. She was laughing, head tilted back in that way I used to know. He leaned close, hand on her thigh. My heart should have shattered. Instead, I felt numb, as if I were watching a rerun of a show that had long since lost its power to surprise me. I ducked into an alley and vomited, shame mixed with salt and bile. I sat on the cold pavement, knees pulled to my chest, wondering if I would ever feel whole again. Not healed, just whole. like all my pieces belonged to the same person. The spiral deepened. I began avoiding mirrors entirely. When I brushed my teeth, I stared into the sink. When I passed store windows, I turned my gaze. I was afraid of what I'd see, afraid I'd see him, and worse, that I'd accept it. I started hearing his voice when I spoke, not the words, but the cadence, the clipped syllables, the pauses that carried threat. It made me pull back from friends, from colleagues. I stopped answering calls. I told people I was busy. Truthfully, I was hiding from the world, from myself. I kept writing though. That was the only thing that tethered me. I wrote until my knuckles ached. I wrote in parks, on trains, in the bathroom, at work. I filled journals with pages that would never be read. Sometimes they were addressed to Clara, sometimes to him, often to no one. In one entry, I wrote, "Is identity just the accumulation of what we've survived, or is it what we choose, despite that?" Another, "What if healing means letting go of the version of yourself that needed the wound to explain your softness?" I kept thinking of my mother. Her silence, her survival. Was she strong, or simply numb? I wanted to ask her, but I didn't. I couldn't risk hearing that she had made peace with him. I needed to believe that someone else saw what I did, that someone else bore witness. The nights grew quieter, lonelier. The rage faded, replaced by a dull throb of resignation. I went to a grief group once, sat in the back, listened. No one talked about betrayal. No one mentioned fathers. Just death. But it felt close enough. Loss is loss. One man, maybe 70, said, "I used to think closure was about answers. Now I think it's about exhaustion. You stop needing to know." That stayed with me. I stopped looking for Clara in crowds. Stopped waiting for his name to appear on my phone. I started sitting with the ache instead of trying to cure it. Some days it felt manageable. Other days, it didn't. I saw a child once at the park, sitting on his father's shoulders, giggling, gripping his hair. The father looked up, laughed, spinning in circles. I should have smiled. Instead, I felt something inside me wither, not out of envy, but mourning. Mourning for the version of me that had hoped for that. The spiral slowed, but it never ended. I learned to walk within it, like navigating a familiar labyrinth. I still hear his voice sometimes, still see her face in dreams, but they're softer now. Less like knives, more like scars. And in the quietest moments, I ask myself, if I could go back, change it all, would I still be me, or would I just be another version of him rewritten in brighter ink? Would it matter? I don't know, but I'm still here. And maybe, for now, that's enough. There are losses you can explain, and those that hollow you from the inside out. This was the latter. The wound that didn't bleed, just whispered. It whispered in the mornings, when I couldn't get out of bed. It whispered in the gaps between phone calls, in the meals I stopped cooking, in the way I let my plants die. It whispered in my reflection, asking, always asking, "What did you expect?" I wanted to rage. I wanted to scream until the walls collapsed. I wanted to break something, anything, just to prove I still had force. But I did what I had always done. I folded. I let it wash over me, like a tide. I told people I was okay. I smiled at work. I said things like, "It wasn't meant to be." I played the gracious ex, the strong son, the resilient man. Inside, I was disintegrating. I moved through the world like someone underwater. Sound was muffled. Time was slow. I'd find myself sitting for hours, staring at the same wall, replaying old conversations. I would analyze every moment with Clara, every silence, every word. Was there something I missed? Some signal I didn't pick up? I tried to blame her. I tried to hate her. But my anger always collapsed into ache. Beneath it all was the sense that she had seen something I hadn't. That maybe I was lacking, that my softness wasn't lovable, just forgettable. I tried to blame him. That was easier. He had always taken what he wanted. My childhood, my sense of peace. And now, Clara, the only person who had made me believe I was something more than a shadow. But even that fury began to curdle. I saw him in myself, in my posture, in the way I looked away when people cried. I wondered if Clara hadn't traded me for him, but traded one version of him for another, a quieter tyrant, a more palatable storm. And that thought, it broke me. I stopped visiting my mother. I couldn't bear to see the house, couldn't bear the smell of that old furniture, the way it still echoed with her silence. I imagined Clara there, curled on the couch I had sat on as a boy, laughing at a joke he'd told her, maybe touching his arm. It made my stomach turn. I quit my job. I moved to a new apartment, started boxing, lifting weights. I needed to feel something in my body, to ground the ache with sweat and bruises. At night, I would collapse into bed, muscles aching, and still the dreams would come. Dreams of him, of Clara, of a younger version of myself, locked in a room with no door. Dreams where I was always arriving just a second too late. One morning, I found myself staring into the bathroom mirror, gripping the sink. My eyes were bloodshot, my jaw tight. I thought of my father shaving in front of this same kind of mirror, years ago, expression blank. And I realized I was making the same face. I smashed the mirror. It cracked down the middle, splitting my reflection into a dozen broken versions of myself. I stood there for a long time, bleeding from my hand, staring into that fractured world. Something had to break. And it did. I began writing. Not stories, not essays, letters, to Clara, to him, to myself. I filled notebooks with unsent truths. Pages of rage, sorrow, tenderness. I wrote until my hand cramped, until my heart began to uncoil. I wrote about being a boy who wanted to be good, who thought goodness would protect him, who learned too late that goodness without boundaries is just permission for others to take. I wrote about the silence that taught me how to vanish, and how, in loving Clara, I thought I had finally been found, only to realize I had never truly stepped into the light. I wrote, and in writing, I grieved, not just for Clara, not just for the betrayal, but for the boy I had been. The one who never got to believe he was enough. And still, after all the pages, I was no closer to answers, only more questions. What does it mean to love someone who chose your wound over your heart? What does it mean to forgive a man who doesn't believe he's done anything wrong? Can healing happen in silence, or does it need the language of pain? I don't know. But I kept writing. He opened the door with that same unfazed look, brows lifted, mouth flat. He was in his usual clothes, jeans and a flannel button-down, with the sleeves rolled up, as though he'd just come from doing something physical, something that proved he still had control over the world. Clara smiled, extending her hand. "You must be Thomas," she said. He looked at her hand for a second, then shook it with a grin. "I hadn't seen in years. So this is the famous Clara." Famous. The words sat in my chest like a splinter. He never referred to me as anything but the kid or boy. Not even my name. That night he said Clara's name more times than he'd said mine in the last decade. We had dinner. My mother made roast chicken. The conversation hovered around safe topics. Weather, work, books. Clara liked. She tried. God, she tried. She leaned into his stories, laughed at his jokes, asked follow-up questions, and he performed. He was animated, confident, charming in that old-world way that makes you forget, temporarily, what he's capable of. Afterward, Clara said, "He's different than I expected." "Different how?" I asked. She shrugged. "He's intense, sure, but he listens. He sees people. He sees people." That word dug in deep. It started small. After that, she'd mentioned something he'd said. Quote one of his metaphors. "Like your dad said, a man's only as honest as his regrets." I didn't remember him ever saying that. Maybe he never did. Maybe he just knew how to make things sound ancient and wise. They began texting. At first it was innocent, coordinating a dinner, sharing an article. Then she started having long conversations with him over the phone. She'd say things like, "It's good for him to open up, right? He doesn't seem to have anyone else." The first time I saw them together without me, on the back porch, heads close, sharing a cigarette, I felt it, a twist in the gut, but I ignored it, because Clara loved me, right? She said so. She said I was her calm, her anchor. But gradually, her language changed. She started pointing out what she called my indecisiveness, my emotional distance, my passivity. "I need more," she told me once, late at night, the glow of her phone lighting up her face. "I need someone who challenges me." Wasn't I enough? One day, she didn't come home. She texted, said she needed space. A week passed, then two. I called, left voicemails. No answer. I drove to her sister's place. Clara wasn't there. Then, one night, I got a message from my mother. Short, blunt. "You should know Clara moved in with your father." I stared at the words, waiting for them to rearrange themselves, for the universe to correct its own cruelty. I confronted her. I demanded an explanation. All she said was, "I didn't plan this, but with him, I feel seen. I feel alive." Seen. That word again. She said it like an apology, but her eyes held something else. Pity. Maybe even contempt. For me, for the smallness I had fought so long to escape. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood there and nodded like a good son, like someone who had learned how to disappear. Later that night, I walked past a mirror in the hallway and caught a glimpse of myself. Not the whole of me, just a fragment. My jaw clenched, my eyes hollow, my posture slouched, and I wondered, had I ever really existed outside his shadow? Or had I always been a copy, a lesser draft? I sat in my car until sunrise, gripping the steering wheel until my hands went numb, and I remembered what he used to say. "A man doesn't cry when the roof caves in. He finds a hammer and starts rebuilding." But what if the house was never yours to begin with? What if you were just squatting in someone else's blueprint, waiting to be evicted by the better version of yourself? There were two types of silence in our house, the one that came when he was away, and the one that came when he was watching. The first was lighter, like the air had been let back in. The second was denser than gravity, pulling everything inward, compressing even the laughter until it broke down into a whisper or vanished completely. It was a silence that taught you to measure your breathing, that made the floorboards betray you, each creak a potential invitation for disapproval. You learned to map the pressure points of the house like a soldier memorizes a minefield. My mother was the first ghost I knew. She moved like vapor, slipping through rooms, managing moods. She rarely spoke when he was around. Her sentences were brief, practical. Her eyes never lingered. I watched her disappear one day at a time, swallowed by the long, quiet war of surviving him. I thought that was normal. I thought love meant learning to vanish. Even the clocks seemed to tick more cautiously when he was home. The dog, an old mutt we inherited from a neighbor, used to hide beneath the kitchen table at the sound of his boots. And I envied him. At least the dog had permission to retreat. I used to count the seconds between his footsteps. I learnt the rhythm of his moods. If he paused too long before entering the living room, it meant something had gone wrong that day. If he tossed his keys too hard onto the counter, it was best not to ask about dinner. He had a chair, not just a place to sit, a throne, a leather recliner, cracked and heavy, that no one else dared touch. It faced the television, but more often than not, he didn't even turn it on. He just sat, brooding in his silence. My mother would leave him a drink on the side table without a word. I never knew if he appreciated it. She did it anyway. Rituals are like that. Not about results, but survival. We weren't a family. We were an ecosystem built around one predator. And I was always prey. School was a sanctuary, but even there, his voice haunted me. I never raised my hand unless I was certain I had the right answer. I avoided eye contact with authority figures. Praise made me flinch. Criticism felt like prophecy. I remember once, in 9th grade, I got the lead in the school play. It was the first thing I ever felt proud of. Clara came to see it. This was before we were a couple, before either of us knew what we'd mean to each other. She brought flowers. My mother came too. My father didn't. When I asked him why later, he didn't even look up from the newspaper. "Plays are for girls," he said. That one sentence unraveled weeks of joy. I tossed the flowers in the trash. I never did another play. He had that power, the ability to puncture a dream with a glance, a grunt, a word. And what's worse, he made it feel like your fault. like you were foolish for dreaming in the first place. But then Clara entered more fully into my life. And for the first time, the silence began to lose its grip. With her, I spoke freely. I laughed without bracing for impact. I started to believe I could live a different kind of life. We'd sit on the couch for hours, legs tangled, sharing stories. I told her things I'd never said aloud. She called it unpeeling, like I was an onion, finally opening to the air. She never flinched at my layers. She welcomed them. One night, I cried in front of her. I don't remember why exactly. Some small crack in the day let the flood through. She held me, didn't try to fix it, didn't make me feel weak, just held me like I was something precious, not broken. That was when I started to believe I could be more than my history. Still, the past has a way of leaking into the present. When Clara asked to meet my parents, I hesitated. I told her it wasn't necessary. She insisted, not because she was naive, but because she believed healing meant confrontation. She wanted to understand the soil I had grown in, to meet the man who had shaped the contours of my fears. I wanted to protect her from him, from the possibility that she might see something in him that would shake the image she had of me, or worse, that she might not see the monster at all. But I agreed. I told myself it was time. That perhaps love could soften even the hardest shadows. I told myself that bringing her into my old house would be like an exorcism, a purging of ghosts. I told myself a lot of things. What I didn't tell her, what I didn't even fully admit to myself, was that part of me still needed him to approve, not just of her, but of the life I had made, of the man I had become. I didn't understand then that approval from a man like him is not a gift, it's a transaction. And there's always a price. He had my face, only older, more angular, more weathered, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I used to look at him and wonder if one day I'd become like him, gruff, confident, untouchable, but I never did. I stayed soft. I stayed afraid. He walked like the world owed him something. I tiptoed like I owed the world an apology. Sometimes I wonder if that's why he always won. Or maybe it was never about winning. Maybe it was about who was willing to lose without realizing it. His was the kind of presence that filled a room without noise. He didn't need to bark orders or raise his voice. He merely existed, and the rest of us adjusted. A glance from him could silence a room, and not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that presses down, making the air heavier, the walls thinner. He stood tall in every photograph, chin up, lips tight, as if daring the world to challenge him. I used to trace the outlines of his younger self in those faded pictures, wondering if somewhere inside that sepia-toned defiance was a sliver of softness. If he had ever been like me before, life carved him into something jagged. I used to envy him, his sureness, his gravity. He didn't just take up space, he claimed it, owned it. People leaned in when he spoke, as if his words carried a truth the rest of us couldn't touch. I, on the other hand, felt like an afterthought in my own life, like an echo still searching for its origin. And yet for all that envy, there was a quiet dread too. A fear that his reflection was my inheritance, that no matter how hard I tried to be different, I was slowly becoming him. Not through intention, but inevitability. That my softness was just a pause in a lineage of hardness. He wasn't cruel in overt ways, but he wielded his silence like a blade. He knew how to withhold approval, attention, affection, just long enough to make you question your worth. I spent my childhood trying to decipher his moods, to earn scraps of praise that never came, and when they did, they felt more like warnings than rewards. There's one moment I remember vividly. I was 8. I'd drawn a picture, nothing special, just a boy and his dog under a tree. I showed it to him, heart thudding with hope. He looked at it for a second, then handed it back without a word. That silence roared louder than any insult could have. It told me I hadn't reached him. I hadn't mattered. That night, I tore up the drawing and flushed it down the toilet. It felt like erasing a part of myself that dared to ask for love. These were the beginnings of the fracture, the slow dismantling of a boy who once believed he could be seen, and in his place, a shadow grew. one that looked a lot like my father. The older I got, the more I realized I was building my life around avoiding him. Every decision, a quiet rebellion. I chose art over athletics, softness over strength, listening over asserting. But even in that rebellion, he was the axis. I was still orbiting his gravity. He had this way of making you feel like your choices were wrong, simply because they weren't his. Like the path you walked was a mistake, unless it matched his footprints. And so I learned to walk quieter, slower, hiding the parts of myself that might invite his disdain. And yet, I still craved his approval, still longed for that moment, however fleeting, when he might look at me and see a man worth respecting. That desire was my first betrayal of myself, and not the last. It's strange how someone can shape your life more through absence than presence, how the things they don't say, the moments they don't show up for, become louder than any words ever could. He didn't attend my school plays, he never came to my art shows, but his absence loomed like a monument. I performed for an invisible audience, hoping he'd hear the applause through the walls. In time, I learned to stop expecting. I called it strength, but really, it was resignation. And then Clara entered my life. She was light in a world that had been grey for too long. She had this way of laughing that made people turn to look, not because it was loud, but because it was real. Unfiltered, she danced without music, spoke with her hands, loved with her eyes. She told me I was different, that my quietness wasn't a flaw, but a refuge. That in a world of shouting men, I was a whisper worth leaning into. I didn't know how to receive that kind of love. I tried to hold it gently, afraid I might crush it with my uncertainty. We met at a bookstore. She was standing in the poetry section, flipping through Neruda. I made a joke about love sonnets being emotional sabotage. She laughed. I fell in love. Not in that moment, but not long after. With Clara, I felt seen, not for what I could be, but for what I already was. And that was revolutionary. We moved in together a year later, talked about marriage, children, a dog. She liked the idea of planting roots. I liked the idea of growing into someone who could protect them. But somewhere in the back of my mind, there was a shadow, one with my face, but not my spirit. And I didn't realize how close it was until the day I introduced her to him. That day began with such hope. I wore my best shirt. Clara brought a bottle of wine. I had rehearsed conversations in my head, imagined my father being proud, or at least polite. I thought that maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment where our paths converged, and I could stitch the torn seams of my past with the new thread of love. But even then, part of me knew better. I just didn't want to believe it.